for a little bit more on this and what the implications might be, we're now joined by Professor Dirk Kotze, who's with the University of South Africa and one of our regular political commentators. Prof, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program. I know that there's a lot of excitement about what happened in Parliament and people are pointing the finger, but I suppose where we need to start and stop is, what does Parliament measure that's different from the SIU and other law enforcement agencies in this regard?
Yeah, I think the distinction that we have to draw is that the ethical code of conduct of Parliament for parliamentarians, and that includes also ministers, is trying to prevent conflicts of interest in matters that Parliament are dealing with. So that is, for example, that when it is issues about decision-making in Parliament, whether it's in a portfolio committee or whether it is in a plenary session, where a member of Parliament has an interest in something that is before Parliament, but an external interest. It can be a business interest, it can be a financial interest, it can be any type of other interest, for example, ownership of assets, and that they have to declare. So they have to declare on an annual basis what are, for example, their directorships of companies, their income, their shareholding in companies, their income in forms of gifts that they've received from whoever, whether it is from diplomats or whether it is from businesses or from others, above a certain amount of money. Yeah. So that it can become therefore clear that when a member of Parliament is part of a decision which involves persons that have given them something or that they have an interest in, that their potential conflict of interest is therefore clear. So some of the aspects that the SIU, the Special Investigative Unit, made a pronouncement on with respect to the former Minister Zweli Mkhize are therefore not included in the mandate or the scope that this ethical committee is looking for. For example, his relationship with his son and the possible benefits that his son received from his father involvement as minister. That is not part of parliamentary affairs or parliamentary decision-making processes. But the minister is or has been in the past, while he was still minister, subject to the executive ethics code of conduct. And that's a different kettle of fish. So, but because he's not anymore a minister, therefore it does not apply to him at the moment.
All right, let's explore this relatives story. So an adult son is not treated the same way as a wife, for example.
Yeah, I think this is the grey area, and this is where the interpretation by this committee might be possible to challenge that. That their interpretation is not absolutely watertight, because normally it talks about the idea that a member of Parliament and his or her dependents. Now, whether, and therefore, I would say from a feminist point of view, many people will say a wife is, or a husband in terms of a marriage, is not supposed to be seen as a dependent, but that is how it is defined by this code of conduct. Whether a son or a daughter is regarded, depending on their age, whether they can be regarded as a dependent becomes a debatable issue. And I think we've seen it also with President Ramaphosa when the question was asked about his son in a question and answer session by John Steenhuisen, and how that became a controversial issue in the affairs of Parliament. So this report by the Ethics Committee, I think, is maybe not the last say on this matter specifically.
All right. I guess what may happen is that the rules, the laws probably will get challenged and get better written as a result of cases like this.
Yes, I guess so. The question about ethics is not a very easy question to deal with in Parliament, because ethics is not about necessarily something which is illegal. Unethical conduct is not necessarily always illegal conduct or unconstitutional conduct, but it is something which is again going against the norms, the accepted norms that's expected of persons or members of parliament to follow. So it is something which is a little bit more in a grey area and therefore much more difficult to define also. When it comes to what is legal or illegal, it is about South African law, which includes the acts of parliament and common law and all other things. But ethics is about judgment. It is about what is regarded by a committee like this to be ethical or unethical given the guidelines that exist. But guidelines are always only general guidelines. They cannot deal with all specific issues. And that is why ethical matters become very often debatable and contested also by others.
And also, I guess, his status as an MP is not affected for as long as he's not convicted of a crime, or even if he has been convicted, that he hasn't served a sentence. I believe it's more than a year. If you serve a sentence less than a year, you can still be an MP. So all of that hasn't played out at this stage, and therefore his position as an MP remains secure.
Yes, that is indeed so. Based on this judgment, even if they've said that he acted unethically, it doesn't mean he's automatically disqualified as a member of parliament. Because as you said, it is about when someone has been found guilty by a court, and when there's not an option between a fine and a jail sentence. And then also that person will be disqualified for 5 years after he or she has served that sentence. Now, none of this applies to former Minister Mkhize. So from that point of view, this does not affect his position in Parliament.
All right.
But I think what one has to say is,
Yeah, carry on.
Now, I think what one has to say is that when it comes to ethical issues, it's very often it's incumbent on the person, him or herself, to resign. And that is what is supposed to happen and happens in many parts of the world. It's not that they have to be found guilty or that a report judgment comes out to say, well, you have transgressed this code of conduct. When someone has reached the point where that person is, in the public opinion, has done something which is detrimental to the reputation of that institution, then normally that person should resign.
So on that basis, what you're saying is that people who have been fingered in the State Capture Commission report, for example, even though they haven't been found guilty of criminal activity at this stage, good ethics would suggest if I'm an MP, I should step down.
That is indeed so. That is so. And for a minister, it is even more relevant. And we've seen it in many parts of the world where someone has been implicated. It's not even been charged. It's not even been found guilty by a court of law. Then they step down. They voluntarily resign. And I think this is the type of culture that should be developed amongst public representatives and public servants.
All right, so I'm going to play devil's advocate. Boris Johnson has been fined for those COVID-19 parties. Ethically, should he resign?
Strictly speaking, yes. And I think this is what has happened in the past, especially in a country like the UK, where ministers, where they became implicated in the media or in the public domain, and when they know they are going to experience problems, then in order to prevent it spilling over to the rest of the cabinet, to the rest of their colleagues, and there's a bad reflection on the government in general, they normally resign. And that is the type of culture that we don't have in South Africa, because I think many people were saying, use this argument, you are not guilty until being found guilty by a judicial process. But that is not what ethics is about. Ethics is about what is in the best interest and based on reputation and integrity. And it's not about legality or illegality.
Okay, perhaps as a final question, let's come back to your area of expertise, political analysis. So we've had this interesting case over the weekend where The ANC has a chairperson in KwaZulu-Natal who is charged with a very serious crime. And now people might say, but hang on, this guy, Dr. Zweli Mkhize, his hands are not clean. How is it that Parliament can clear him? And the ANC, should they act? Should they say, withdraw him because of the revelations that have come up? What should be playing out? Is there a political consequence for doing nothing?
I think, yes, there will be, because what is now being seen, and I think it's going to confuse the public, is to say, well, he has been identified as a person who has been involved through the Special Investigative Unit in the digital vibes, and there's some evidence available, and that it's most likely that he will be prosecuted ultimately. But now Parliament is saying, well, they don't have a problem with that. And I think that's the confusion within the ANC and in general that will develop with this. But I think where this issue is becoming problematic is the fact that, take for example, that the step-aside principle that's being applied. In his case, it is not now applied because it, strictly speaking, doesn't deal with a position within the ANC, like the top six or the NEC, but it deals with his role as a public representative. And what the step-aside rule is not saying is that public representatives must step aside. And I think this is the gap in that application, which is quite problematic and will really confuse the public about, again, the reputational or the ethical component that should be added to the legal or illegal or the judicial elements that's involved in this.
Professor Dirk Kotze, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much indeed for your insights tonight.
Thank you very much.